Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the new ZMF Caldera Close. This is ZMF's latest closed back planar magnetic kind of flagship headphone, and it's bringing a pretty flagship price at $3,500 US, which is not cheap, I know, but kind of for me it was interesting to spend some time with this headphone because ZMF has been one of the last hi-fi brands for me to really wrap my head around for a couple of reasons. One, like I don't have any friends that own a pair of ZMF headphones, so I haven't had the opportunity to, before now, just spend some at-home time with one of their headphones. But the other thing that makes ZMFs a little bit hard to know, okay, here's actually two things. One, I've been to CanJam shows, a number of CanJam shows. ZMF is always there. Usually they've got like their own dedicated room to them, but they're so popular that I've had a hard time actually just getting in and having a chair and spending some time listening to them there. And then the other aspect of it is that even if I did get some time to sit down with their headphones, I did a little bit. Okay, I'll be honest, I got some time with them. They offer their headphones in so many different custom variations, like different woods, different ear pads, and that can affect the sound. And that just means like I don't know which version I was listening to at CanJam. And when I watch a review and people like their headphones, they like to be able to customize it. I think that is a cool aspect, but it makes it hard to understand which version that person is reviewing and how does that compare with what I would buy stock, you know, from the store, and all of that just kind of served to make the brand a little bit mysterious for me, and in a way that's kind of cool, but also just a little bit mysterious. So I was thankful that Zach was kind enough to send this headphone in for review, as along with a plethora of different pads. So I've got this pad. I've also got two other pads that I was able to swap onto the Caldera Close, throw them on my measurement rig. So I've got them on Squiglink. We're going to talk about all this stuff a little bit later, but all this is just to say that I wanted to spend some time with this headphone, and I wanted to give it a review from the perspective of what it sounds like stock, and then we'll talk about those other modifications and stuff that you can make, just to give you a sense of where you can take this headphone given your own preferences. But anyway, I think that will do for the intro. So I guess just a quick shout out to Zach from ZMF for sending this headphone in. If you want to check out the Caldera Close or anything else they've got, I've got them linked in the description down below. But that will lead us into talking about the physical form factor on this headphone. We'll talk about what comes inside the box, the build quality on this headphone, the comfort. Then we'll get into talking about the sound. We'll start with those frequency response graphs that I talked about, but we'll also talk about my subjective listening impressions, as well as how this headphone compares to a couple of other premium closed back headphones, because I've got a couple on hand, and those comparisons I think will be of some use. So let's start with what comes inside the box. And before I do that, here's the box. This is quite the hefty case. This is like, I don't even know what you call this. It's got locks on it. Like, that's nice. If you're buying a premium $3,500 headphone, to have that sort of accessory, it's a little bit overkill, but it's stackable. So if you had a bunch of ZMF headphones, I guess they would all stack nicely. And I think that's pretty cool. But otherwise, you get what you see here on the table, including, yes, two different sets of pads, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But let's start by talking about the cables, all right? And yes, you do get two separate cables. And I think these are the stock cables. Zach sent me a handful of different parts for these headphones, so I'm kind of like backward engineering what came in the stock package, but I believe this is it. The pictures online look a little bit different, but you get, from my understanding, this is what they call like the stock ZMF cable. It is like a nylon braided cable. And I like this. It's a nice length. It's about 4 foot in terms of length. Not super long. If you're looking for like a desktop length cable, you might find this a little bit short, but for me personally, I'm always listening on portable sources, so a 4 foot cable is actually pretty much ideal. One thing that's nice, kind of the first touch of customization with this headphone, is you can get it with any termination that you like. Here, comes in a 4.4 mil balance. You can get it 3.5 mil single-ended, 6.3 mil, or even a balanced XLR connector, which I think is kind of cool. And then the cable up here terminates into these dual XLR minis, which are what plug into the bottom of the headphone itself. Like I said, it does come with two different cables. This is the second cable, which I think they call this their OFC cable. It's a little bit different. It's got, rather than a nylon sheathing or not nylon jacket, it's got your more traditional silicone jacket, kind of like an IEM cable weave. I like this. This one's a little bit on the longer side, but still terminates into the dual mini XLR, and then again you can customize this termination however you'd like. In fact, you can get one of these in single-ended, one of them balanced, however you prefer to mix and match them. And I think that's actually kind of a nice little touch. But apart from that, I guess I'll highlight briefly that this thing comes with two different pads. So this here is the stock pad. This is the Caldera Close hybrid pad. You can see that it's got kind of a suede material on the inside and a perforated leather on the outside, and then just a solid leather here on the outside. And then this one was shipped to me with the suede, Caldera suede pad, which is, got the basically same construction, just a different material. It's got the suede material. Now, that said, while that's what my headphone came with, you can get this with a bunch of different materials. In fact, I mentioned that he sent this with some other pads. Here's just some examples of other pads that I've got. This is the protein leather, or otherwise known as fake leather, faux leather pad, which there's that. And then this one is, I believe, a lambskin leather. You can see this one's actually a little bit on the deeper side versus the others, but we'll talk about what those do to the sound. And that's how, honestly, I would make the purchase decision on which pad to go with, is going to be based on sound, because that is a big difference that these pads make. Now, I certainly have my preferences in terms of fit and comfort. I'm always a sucker for a suede or like a micro suede like this. So that's my preference in terms of fit and comfort. But again, when it comes to picking a pad, I really do think you should prioritize sound. And we'll talk about what these things do to the sound when I talk about the sound. But for now, let's just continue with the build quality on this headphone. And it's just generally, like, this is like part of what makes a ZMF is this hand-built real wood cups. You can see these things are like hand polished, hand carved. And here on the Caldera Close, they've got some pretty fancy sculpting to the ear cups that I think is, frankly, pretty stinking handsome. Overall, the headphone kind of has the aesthetic of like a lazy boy couch. Like, it's super plush, it's super thick, it's a little bit on the old-fashioned side, but it's also got just like heirloom qualities, right? If you're looking for a headphone that you could buy and like pass on for generations, a lot of plastic built headphones, frankly, they might last plenty because most headphones are pretty durable, but they're not really that special. Something like this is pretty special because it's unique. It's made out of, again, real wood. So if you buy one of these, your outer pattern is actually going to look a little bit different. And in fact, from what I can tell on the pictures, it seems like this is not actually the stock wood that the Caldera comes in. Maybe they rotate between different stock woods, but the current stock look is a little bit more aggressive. And frankly, I actually kind of like this one better. It's just more chill. And you see nice wood grain pattern to it without it being overly aggressive. But apart from the wood, you've still got really nice build materials. Like these yokes here are metal. This here is all metal. You've got a nice clicky adjustment mechanism. And I will highlight also, there is a screw here on the back that you can use to tighten the adjustment. So if you want to make it so it's harder to adjust, make it so that it just stays in place more, you can tighten that screw, or even tighten it all the way to the point that, frankly, you can adjust it. That's kind of a nice option to have if you're only using these on your head. Obviously, it makes it harder to share the headphone if you're doing that. But apart from that, you've still got this really plushly padded headband up here. I believe this is all leather. You got this leather strap down here, which, the headband itself has padding on it, but then you have the suspension strap underneath of it, which I guess just distributes the weight a little bit. Although the fact that it's actually touching the padding makes me wonder how much it's actually doing as far as like suspension. That said, I don't really have any problems with it in terms of comfort. Now, the last thing I'll highlight on this before I throw this on my head is that the ear cups do, they swivel in and out. They've got some tilt inside and out that way as well. And I find that the tilt on these is sufficient to the point that, in fact, you can get the ear cup to completely like fall through the yokes here, which just give you quite a bit of fit and adjustability for your particular head. So I guess that will lead me into throwing this on my particular head. And we'll talk about the fit and comfort. So generally, the fit and comfort on this headphone is quite nice, as you might expect of a very plush looking headphone as it is. Weight on it is a little bit on the heavy side. I think the claimed weight is around 530 grams, which I also matched on my scale. I don't personally have an issue with around 530 grams. That to me is fine. Anything above 600 grams, I start to feel the weight of it. But this at 530 grams is certainly not a lightweight headphone if you're used to like a Sony XM5 Bluetooth headphone, that weighs literally less than half of what this thing weighs, okay? Just to give you an idea of how much this thing weighs. But again, 530 grams for me has not been a problem. In terms of the ear cups themselves, I've got plenty of room in there. I'll give you a view of the ear pad. Plenty of room, both top to bottom, left to right, for my ear. The depth on these is not particularly deep. You know, they are fairly plushy, but you can see, especially near the front of the ear pad, is somewhat on the shallow side. But I don't know. I don't, again, have any issues with this thing in terms of fit and comfort and room for my ears. Generally, I find this to be a very comfortable headphone to kind of sit back and relax in. It's not going to be, you know, it's not compact, so like, I don't know, if you're looking for something to be comfortable on an airplane with, maybe that's not this one. I guess quickly on that note, a note on the isolation, you know, because it is a closed back headphone. I found that it doesn't isolate the high frequency stuff quite as much as some other headphones, although as I'm talking to you here, my voice is pretty well occluded, so it's definitely a closed back design. I just found that versus some of the other headphones that I've had on comparison, this one seemed to isolate the least, but it still isolates. Okay, anything else to talk about physical form factor with this headphone? Let me just check my notes real quick, but I don't think so. I guess before we dive into the sound real quickly, I'll just note on the drivability of this particular headphone. In terms of like, do you need a super powerful amp? My thought is no. It's probably better to drive this thing off of an amp or a portable source that's got some output power, right? An Apple dongle, you might be able to just squeeze out of it, but probably not going to be, you're not going to have a whole lot of headroom, especially if you're using EQ. That said, it's not like crazy hard to drive. I would say that this is comparable to like my Sennheiser HD600. If you've used that headphone, you have a good sense of how much power you're probably going to need to drive this headphone. I was able to drive this thing fine off of my MacBook. In fact, I could get it much louder than I want to listen to on my MacBook. But I also know that my MacBook has got a little bit more juice than your average like smartphone or something like that. So there you go. Hopefully that gives you a sense of where this thing is in terms of drivability. But that will lead us into talking about the sound. And I'm looking over here because I want to pull up the squig. Here is the frequency response that I've measured of the Caldera Close on my rig. If you want to check this out, I've got it linked in the description down below, but it's on SquigLink. And I've measured it, like I mentioned, with a bunch of different pads. In fact, here, I'll just kind of highlight for you. You've got it with, I've also measured it with different meshes, as well as different pads. You can kind of see what changes those make. But we're going to start by just analyzing the stock sound with the stock pad, which is, again, the hybrid pad. And the frequency response that you get is, okay, there's a couple of features here that I think are worth highlighting that should give you a decent sense of what this sounds like, okay? Feature number one is a little bit of a mid-bass boost here, but overall I would say this is a warm tilted sound signature. A little bit of this dip in this mid-range here, which I don't know exactly how to describe what this sounds like. Like I don't see that dip in the frequency response and think, okay, I know what that sounds like. It could go either give it like a contrasty sound, but then you have like this rise in, the 1.5K region, which can tend to give a sound signature like a low contrast mid-range. So I think overall, it just kind of ends up giving it somewhat of a slightly odd, sour mid-range tonality, but otherwise, like it's generally just kind of like a soft mid-range and overall a warm sounding sound signature. Now the treble performance, I would say this is like in line with neutral. There's a little bit of upper treble sparkle and it does have kind of that characteristic to my ear where it does sound a little bit extra energetic in the upper treble, but it's very, very well done. It's tastefully boosted. I didn't find it to be fatiguing or sharp or anything like that. It just adds a little bit of extra excitement to the upper treble without it going over the top in my mind. But yeah, overall, I would say that this is, that's kind of roughly what to expect from the sound. It's a little bit on the warm sounding side, a little bit low contrast, a little bit exciting up top, but pretty tame and pretty tasteful, and maybe just a little bit odd in kind of the mid-range tonality. Again, I think that these two features are probably the aspects of the sound signature that I have the most issue with. If I use EQ to balance these out, again, kind of drop 1.5K and then boost this around 400 hertz, it really does add a nice sense of contrast to the sound and fill out what can otherwise sound a little bit bodiless in the mid-range. But generally that's kind of what to expect of the stock sound signature. Like I mentioned, I did want to talk about how this sounds with some other alternate pads. So let's do a quick dive on that. Again, if you want to explore this stuff yourself, it's all on Squiglink, but let's take a look at it together. So I will leave this graph up. Actually, briefly, let me mention this. Because Zach did also send this through with these pads, these little swappable meshes. So the pads come off really easy. And by default, it has this red mesh on here. This is on here with an adhesive. You can peel this up and replace it with one of these alternate meshes, which do change the sound. I did want to mention briefly that these changes are pretty mild. These are pretty modest changes. So while I enjoy pad swapping, it's kind of fun to experiment with different sound signatures, and can be just kind of fun to have a handful of different pads on hand to swap them around and see what differences you get. These things, partly because they're adhesive, it's not that fun to swap them, but also the differences are pretty minor. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend like buying those out of the gate. I would listen to the stock headphone first and then see which direction you want to go with it, because here's what to expect. All right, here's the stock red mesh. If you throw on the black mesh, it might make it slightly more energetic, and then if you throw on the green mesh, it makes it slightly more relaxed in the kind of the mid treble region. But again, it's a pretty modest difference. So I personally, if you know, you listen to the stock headphone and you have a good sense of where you would like it changed, if that minor difference makes a difference for you, okay, go ahead and make that purchase, but just know it's a pretty small difference. Now the pads themselves make a much bigger difference. So again, here's what it measures like with the stock pad. With the lamb pad, you know, you get a little bit of slightly more laid back upper mid range here, maybe a little bit more treble energy, but I wouldn't read too much overly into this here, because just treble and measurements generally can be be a little bit fickle on these measurement rigs. But yeah, I think that's roughly what to expect. Typically, I find the lamb just gives it a little bit more contrast, I guess, makes it a little bit sharper, but doesn't overly drastically change the sound. With the protein pad, again, similarly, you get maybe a little bit extra, you know, lower mid-range, upper bass bump with the protein pads, and that's generally what I kind of experience with protein pads in general, is it just gives it, again, a little bit more of that punchy sound signature, but maybe a little bit more contrasty. Personally, my preference was actually with the suede pad, which I'll throw up on here. And what I found the suede pad did was you know, it's not a significant difference, but it does start to fill out this feature, this gap here that I highlighted as kind of like one of my main bugaboos about the stock tuning. So it fills that out a little bit, and otherwise is more or less the same as the stock tuning. So it just gives it a little bit more of low contrast tune, warmer overall, because there is a little bit of a bass boost with this. But yeah, just generally for me with the Caldera Close, this was my favorite pad, was the suede pad. But it might not be your favorite pad, so there's that. But otherwise, I don't know, let me talk about my other kind of subjective sound impressions of this headphone. Just generally, I find it to be pleasant. It's not super stand out in terms of its incisiveness, but it does have a decently incisive treble performance. Like the separation between sounds is pretty decent. There's just not a lot of body behind it, and I think a lot of it comes down to that mid-range tuning. Is it lacks a little bit of body, which is where I found that the suede pads do a decent job of improving that, not entirely solving it. And with the suede pads, it maybe gets a little bit bassier than I like, but overall, I do prefer that. This just ends up being the more satisfying sound to me. Anything else to say about it? Yeah, again, like stereo width, I would say is fairly okay on this headphone. It is a closed back. Closed backs are not really known for having especially wide stereo width and like strong separation between sounds. I think it does a decent job, but it's not necessarily its strength. And I guess the comparisons with other headphones is probably where we're going to put this stuff into context. So let me pull in those other headphones for said comparison. Just to orient ourselves around all these words that I'm using. So here we've got Meze Liric 2. This is also a closed back planar headphone. Price on this is, I believe, $2,000. So a little bit cheaper than the Caldera, but I don't know, if you're in the realm of closed back premium headphones, these are kind of your options. In terms of form factor, I'll briefly comment on this. You know, you're going to get a much more commercial build out of something like the Meze Liric. It's not as unique, even though you do have wood ear cups and there is going to be some variability there. It's not quite the same experience that you get with the ZMF. That said, I really like the build quality on these headphones. In fact, let me throw it on my head just to kind of show you. This is, like, to me, this is kind of like peak headphone design. I really love the physical form factor here on the Meze Liric. Again, maybe not quite as special and unique as the ZMF, but it is sleeker and, again, a little bit more commercial, and maybe that's more my style. Now, in terms of sound, that's unfortunately where I would say I prefer overall the ZMF. The sound here in the Liric, though, is a much more contrasty V-shaped sound signature. Like where I mentioned, the ZMF is not particularly strong in terms of imaging and separation and, you know, the incisiveness of attack. That is where the Liric is strong, and probably where it's maybe a little bit too strong. It can just be a little bit over aggressive. And like, if I'm summarizing these headphones in a word, I would say that the ZMF is kind of like this laid back, kind of atmospheric sound, whereas the Meze just ends up with this being kind of this contrasty, aggressive sound signature, right? And I think that that is kind of the best way to understand the differences between these two headphones without having heard them. I think the bass is just going to be a lot tighter, punchier, and again, more aggressive here on the Meze Liric. It digs deeper for me, and it's more controlled, but it's also, again, a little bit just too aggressive, especially in the treble. It gives it kind of like this inorganic character to the sound. The upper treble is also just a little bit more zingy on this guy, whereas, again, I mentioned that there is a bit of upper treble boost here on the ZMF, but it's pretty tasteful. Here on the Meze, it's pushing the limits of tastefulness. It can be fun and exciting depending on what you're listening to, but it can also make it a little bit fatiguing to listen to for long. So yeah, again, atmospheric versus aggressive. Which of those sounds better to you? You decide. For me, I would actually pick the ZMF, but do want to bring in one other closed back king over here. This is the Dan Clark Audio E3. Physical form factor, again, kind of similarly to the Meze. This is like a more commercial design. Less unique, I suppose. And frankly, I don't really like the way that the E3 looks, especially this outer panel. It's just a little, it's a weird graphic design, but otherwise the materials on it are quite nice. And this is very lightweight headphone. The Meze is actually pretty lightweight too, but this guy is very lightweight. You can see that form factor wise, it's just like so minimal. And there's something to like about this as well, but it doesn't have, again, quite the charms of the ZMF. Now, in terms of sound, here's where I actually very much prefer the E3. This one is my jam. If you are into a vocal forward sound signature, that is exactly what the E3 is. The mid-range is just fantastic on this. You have really awesome texturing in the mid-range. It's maybe a little bit over forward for certainly some people's taste, but for me, it's really nice to listen to with stuff like Cigarettes After Sex, where it's like this deep, rich sound, but then you just pull those vocals forward and you get all that texturing and layering, and it's something special here on the E3. Whereas I think the ZMF does an okay job with that stuff. It just never really pulls itself together to give me kind of that wow factor that I get with the E3. I wouldn't say that the E3 is necessarily a lot more incisive. Again, if you're looking for incisiveness, I think that the Meze Liric is going to be a lot sharper in the treble and more clear delineation between sounds. There is still somewhat of a blurred character to the transients on this thing, but overall, like the micro contrast, it just does a really, really good job. And there is a nice little bass boost here on the E3, but of the three headphones that I've highlighted here, this is going to be the least bass oriented, the more leaner sound signature. Yeah, it's not as contrasty as either of them, or sorry, it's not as contrasty as the Meze, but it is a little bit more contrasty, I would say, versus this guy. And I guess if I'm doing the same thing I did before, where I'm describing this in a word as atmospheric, I would describe the E3 as just it's not atmospheric, sorry, transparent. It's just got this transparent presentation to the mid-range, which again is what I love so much about this headphone. But I think that will do it for my review here on the ZMF Caldera Closed. again, this headphone's kind of about more than just the sound. It really is about like that pride of ownership aspect, the customizability, being able to tune it and tailor it to exactly how you want, and have a headphone that you can pass on for generations if you want to. Of course, I also listen to these things, and that's pretty important for me. And this thing sounds, I would say, pretty decent, but not particularly standout. I think out of 5 stars overall, I'm going to give this thing a solid 3 stars out of 5. I find this to be a pretty pleasant headphone, especially with the suede pads, even if it's not particularly standout, and it more just ends up, I appreciate it for the build quality and, again, that pride of ownership aspect. And if that sounds interesting to you, well, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, which I've also got linked down below, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
This review is super, yeah, yeah, yeah. This review is super, yeah, yeah, yeah. Join with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the future.